The Apple of Albert's Eye by Jim Miller. Albert was born in a cloud, but this cloud wasn't around his mom in an airplane, or up a mountain, or even around a sailboat. Nothing like that. Albert, you see, was an apple, and his mom, well, Albert's mom, was an apple tree. Albert couldn't see in the cloud, but then the wind pulled it apart like it was cotton candy at a fair, and there he was. He had no idea where he'd come from or how he got there. All the other apples were there before Albert, or at least that's how it seemed to him. They were laughing and shouting, bobbing up and down in the wind, and moving so fast that one minute he could see them, and the next they were gone, hiding under little green covers. Albert didn't want to make a fuss or rock the branch any more than it was already, so he pretended he'd been around for a long time too, and laughed and shouted like the rest. But to tell you the truth, it was making him a little sick. Finally the wind stopped, and Albert had a chance to look around. Albert was very smart for a newborn apple. Even though he couldn't see himself, he decided he must be an apple too. He hoped that he was wrong, because the other apples didn't look too safe, hanging high in the air from those thin little stems. But he was afraid he was right. Albert could look in any direction. Straight up past the stem and branch, there were a lot more green covers and apples hanging over him, and above them, bright blue with puffs of white. Out one side he could see a warm yellow circle in the blue. Out another, he could see his own branch leading to his own trunk, and past that he could see long, long lines of apple-covered trees.
Albert had learned to hang, an apple's first and most important lesson. Soon Albert could hang out, hang on and hang around better than any person ever could. Albert spent many days in the orchard, looking, listening, feeling, growing and, of course, hanging. He could hardly believe there was an even tinier tube inside his tiny stem that fed him the sugary water that was making him grow larger and sweeter. Albert figured the water came from the ground, but didn't know about the sugar. He thought maybe the leaves had something to do with it, but they weren't talking. All he could talk to were apples.
On warm days, Albert and the others would soak up the sun and think of nothing. Sometimes they listened to Walt, the old apple, that said he was on the tree before the young apples were born. Walt wasn't like a young apple. He wasn't red and getting redder. Instead, he was a browny green that didn't look very nice at all. His skin wasn't smooth, but all wrinkly, and there was a nasty black spot where a worm had gotten under it. Walt didn't smell all that nice either. Albert liked to listen to Walt, but some young apples didn't. His strange stories of cold white rain, trees without leaves, and being taken away one day scared them as much as it would probably scare you. Tyler, one of the bigger apples who got more sun than most, said Walt wasn't really an apple at all. On cloudy days, when the bright light was gone, and the rain pelted their faces and the wind tore at their stems, the apples weren't very happy.
One rainy, blowy day, something awful happened. "I'm losing my grip!" shouted Clara. "Hang on!" shouted Albert, helping in the only way he could. Everyone watched nervously as Clara suddenly began to swing wildly off her stem. This was a carnival ride none of them wanted to take. Round and round she swirled, making everyone dizzy, and then Clara was gone. The next morning, Tyler was teasing Albert and the others. When Tyler teased, most of the apples would turn their faces away. Albert tried his best to like Tyler. "After all," Albert said to himself, "we're all part of the same tree." But Tyler was making everyone unhappy this morning. "You'll be the next to go, Albert, just like Clara. You're so small, your stem is weak, and you don't have my color." Albert didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He tried to forget what Tyler had said, but that wasn't easy. Was he really smaller than the others? Would his stem keep him safe? Would he blow away like Clara?
Just then, something rattled up below them. It had come and gone before, and Albert had noticed that it seemed to follow the two little lines on the ground. The thing was red like an apple, Parts of it were round like apples, but the other end was straight. And inside the straight end was another thing with lots and lots of straight pieces. Most days the rattly thing moved by, leaving behind a strange smell and a fine blue oily mist that settled on Albert's skin. Walt had said the rattly thing would come and take them all away one day. When it stopped right under Albert, all the apples held their breath. The most amazing thing had happened. The rattly thing opened 2 wings. Albert was beginning to wonder if it was a large bird, when out stepped 2 very strange shapes. Were they animals? Albert had seen robins with apple-red tummies, and butterflies that flew so crazily it made you dizzy to watch them. There were lots of insects and caterpillars in the orchard. There were the rabbits and gophers and squirrels that climbed the trees too. But what came out of the rattly thing looked more like a tree than an animal. They had 1 apple right on top, and just below 2 branches with smaller branches on the ends. Albert was a little sorry to see that there weren't any apples or leaves on those little branches. He hoped the trees were healthy, and their 1 apple on top didn't blow away easily in the wind, like Clara had. In the middle, their main trunk split into 2 smaller trunks that touched the ground. The lower branches bent like a robin's leg, and the trees walked away from the rattly thing. Albert tried to think what it would be like on that kind of a tree, but the apples on the walking trees seemed to like it just fine. "Okay, Peg," said one to the other. "Let's do this tree." Albert was surprised, because he could tell what they were saying. Peg reached into the rattly thing with her upper branches and pulled out the long thing with lots of straight lines. The straight thing changed shape and grew faster than any plant until it was just under Albert's nose, resting against a branch. When Peg started climbing up like a squirrel, Albert shook from his skin to his core. The rest of the apples got very quiet and tried their best not to squirm on their stems. Suddenly, the moving tree's apple was right across from him. Albert wasn't sure if he should say hello or not. And what would he say? "Hello, I'm Albert Apple. How are you?" Like most apples, Albert didn't say a word. But he couldn't talk, even if he wanted to, because he was looking at the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. The walking tree's fruit was covered on top with yellow webs from thousands of spiders. The webs flowed out, down and off the apple top. The rest of the fruit was pink, like the inside of a robin's throat. Albert looked into Peg's eyes. They were as beautiful as a rainbow and as powerful as a rain. Peg's upper branch started moving, and there was a scratching sound. Little bits of light brown that smelled like apple were drifting in the air, and some stuck to Albert's skin. A small snap, and a dead branch in Albert's way tumbled to the ground. He could see clearly now. The branch had gone. Peg looked right at Albert, smiled and reached out with one of her upper trunks. The tiny little pink branches on the end curled around him. This was the scaredest Albert had been in his whole life, but instead of hurting, the little branches felt warm, like the sun. Peg smiled at Albert and then spoke. "That'll help you grow, little Mac, or whatever you are," she said.